Okay, ladies and gentlemen, when we're measuring the economy, we ultimately want happiness, better and increased societal and individual welfare, wealth, satisfaction. How do we measure that? Of course, last time we took a look at GDP, gross domestic product, the market value of all goods and services produced. And we can look at the overall GDP of the countries that we study plus the United States, and you will find that the United States, of course, though remember, the United States is not an AP6 country, the United States is the richest country on the planet in terms of GDP economic growth. Over a quarter of all economic growth happens in the United States. Then you have China, the United Kingdom, Russia, Mexico, Nigeria, and Iran has the smallest economic growth overall in the world. 389 billion versus 25 trillion dollars from the richest to the poorest. But does this really show the whole story of a country? Because the amount of that people spend, government spending, net exports, investments, does that really tell the whole story? And we're trying to get a complete story of how we measure the idea of happiness. And so we have to ask some questions here, like, you know, high GDP, does that mean the citizens themselves are wealthy? Does it mean the citizens themselves are healthy? Does it actually mean the citizens themselves in the country are safe? Or in the end, are the citizens in the country actually happy? And so this is where we start getting into other measurements that kind of judge whether economic growth is really happening or not. The number one after GDP that is used is what's called GDP per capita. A GDP per capita. And GDP per capita is taking the gross domestic product of a country and dividing it by population. And what this does is this is considered the measurement of how wealthy, on average, a citizen is of a particular country. You might ask, well, why do you use GDP per capita? And the answer is because when you actually take GDP per capita into account, remember that average, on average, the wealth of a citizen, you start to see correlations in data. So, for instance, this is GDP per capita correlated with supply of calories so that people are getting enough food. And what you notice if you look at this trend line, the more the GDP per capita of a country goes up, the more they have access to food. They are less hungry, so they are more nourished, so they are healthier. That's a good thing. That means the citizens are well off. Now, there are some outliers like Bermuda, which has a higher GDP per capita, but doesn't have access to nearly as much food as a place like Germany, the United States, or Macau. If you look at life expectancy versus GDP per capita, when you see GDP per capita going up, again, we see this trend line where wealthier countries have GDP per capita that are higher. People live longer. Okay. And so there's a correlation there. If we look at years of schooling, well, when you have higher GDP per capita, when countries are wealthier, you see longer time periods of school. You know, down here we look at places like China, Turkey, Vietnam, and you have GDP per capitas in the 20 to 25,000s, and the median number of years of schooling is 8 years. When you get into the wealthier Western European, Japan, France, Singapore, the United States, goes up to 12 years, 13 years, 14 years when you count kindergarten. And then even just self-reported life satisfaction. When people are wealthier, they are more satisfied with how their life is. I mean, things are not as difficult when you are wealthier. You have access to food, um, education. You have access to, you know, greater influences on culture, the arts, music, all kinds of things that make your life overall better. So that's why we use GDP per capita. All right. And of course, child mortality ultimately goes down. Here's the reverse. GDP per capita goes up. The chances that your child is going to die drops. And we would like, of course, all these to be zero. And so, like the United States is actually pretty high for a developed country. But still, you can see a clear trend line here. All right. So, what are we talking about GDP per capita? Well, then this story starts to change. The United States, again, not an AP6 country, 75,269 in terms of GDP per capita is the average per year. But then look at China. And China has only a 12,500 GDP per capita. UK is 45. So which country is actually better off? Because remember, GDP is higher in China, but the average citizen is clearly less wealthy. And where would you rather live, the UK or China? Would you rather live in the UK or the next one down, which is Russia? Because the UK is clearly the second wealthiest country on this chart. It is the wealthiest in terms of average citizen, the wealthiest in the AP6. And down below, you know, Iran had a smaller GDP, but a bigger GDP per capita, as opposed to Nigeria, who has the lowest GDP per capita, the least wealthy citizens of them all. So it's good to focus on GDP, and most economists will do that. But if you really want to look at are citizens well off in that state, in that country, then look at GDP per capita. Then we're going to bring it even farther out. We'll take a look at the Human Development Index, otherwise known as HDI. Now we're going to start looking at, do people have a long and healthy life? Do they have access to knowledge? And do they have a decent standard of living? So, what the Human Development Index does is it takes GDP per capita, life expectancy, how long you're going to live, and mean years of schooling, the average years of schooling that a citizen has within that country. You're going to stick those three indicators together and you come up with something called HDI. HDI is between 0 and 1, 0 being like devastatingly unhealthy, and then, of course, 1 being the healthiest place on earth. Norway has, and basically all the Scandinavian countries have the highest human development indexes. The United States is 0.92, which is high, but could be much higher. Most of that is life expectancy problems. I mean, you can even break it down into regions of a country. So, like in California has an HDI of 0.93, but Massachusetts is actually the highest HDI state. Mississippi in the continental United States is the lowest HDI state. Again, a lot of it is life expectancy. And then American Samoa, in terms of the United States, including the territories, has the lowest there. If we take the AP6 capitals, these are the capital cities of the AP6 countries plus the US. You'll notice London actually has the highest HDI of all of them, higher than even Washington, D.C. Moscow and Beijing are both pleasant places to live. Mexico City, a little less so. And then when you get to Lagos in Nigeria, you see HDI is actually really low. And again, a lot of that is life expectancy. A lot of that is literacy for mean years of education as well. And then, of course, GDP per capita also still really low, even if you're in a city. What are the Human Development Index rates of the AP6 plus the United States? Notice the United States is not first. And again, the US is not an AP6 country. The leading AP6 country for human development is the UK. This is entirely based on life expectancy. The US just does not have a high enough life expectancy to overcome a lot of European states. Russia is third, then Iran, China, Mexico, and again, Nigeria much farther down. So when it comes down to it, people are least well off in a place like Nigeria compared to the rest of the AP6. We mix in the Gini coefficient, the Gini index. This is between 0 and 1. It measures economic inequality. A 0 is perfect equality, a 1 is perfect inequality. If we look around the world, we can see the darker colors are more unequal. Some amount of inequality is not bad because people need to strive for something. It says, well, I want to hold myself to a higher standard. Also, people with higher incomes end up paying for a lot of the taxes that support safety nets. Um, Down here, we have obviously Mexico is probably one of the most unequal countries there. When you get equal countries, you look at the United Kingdom, you look at Nigeria. These don't give a whole story, but you do want countries that have somewhat more equal societies. Not by no means perfectly equal, but it's you have to find a way for people that are down here to be able to rise up and decrease that ability to be unequal to wealthier classes. Finally, we look at development. We look at economic development and how countries um, engage in sectors, and then you'll start getting countries that are put into classifications. The worst of which are going to be failed countries. These are usually super poor. The government doesn't have any control over the vast majority of the state at all. Sometimes it's within it does have no control. Most people live sustenance living on what they can. A lot of it is often there's no economic system available. It's dependent on whatever black market illegal goods that are out there. These are countries like Haiti, Afghanistan, Somalia, and South Sudan, which is the newest country in the world. Underdeveloped countries are usually pretty poor. The government is unstable. Most people live in rural areas. They'll go to cities sometimes for jobs, but they live outside that city in rural areas and tribal areas and commute to those cities. These are often dependent on an agriculture sector above all else. These are places primarily in Africa and East Asia. You're going to have Rwanda, Senegal, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is kind of could be moving towards a developing country. Developing countries have growing middle classes. Governments are much more stable. People often move to cities to work in factories. So these are dependent on factory industrial systems. Places like Indonesia, India, Brazil, and Turkey. India being uh, the most populated developing country on the planet. In the developed countries, strong upper and middle classes, the government's usually very stable. People live in and around cities primarily, suburbs, exurbs, and it's very dependent on the service industry. These are countries like the United States, Germany, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Taiwan, all most Western European countries also mixed in there. How do the AP six plus the United States? Well, the United States is obviously a developed country. The AP six, the United Kingdom, is the only developed country that is here. China, Russia, Mexico, Nigeria, and Iran are all technically considered developing countries. I moved Nigeria and Iran over because they are sliding backwards. Nigeria, even more so. They're starting to get into that government is pretty unstable realm. People are starting to leave the country. It's suffering from brain drain. Iran less so. But those, if you're asked on the AP exam, those are all developing countries with the potential of backsliding. So that is different ways to measure overall economic growth.